And we thought we'd involve all of us in this question, a very provoking question concerning one of the figures, not the principal figure, but certainly a major figure in La Dolce Vita, Steiner. Steiner, the intellectual, Steiner, the wealthy man in Rome who committed suicide and killed his two children. For those who've seen the film, we know this has always been one of the seemingly insoluble questions. And as a result, aside from asking this question of Fellini, whose voice you will hear the conversation in most of the program in the second half, we'll have the voices of Marcello Mastroianni, an excerpt from the conversation with him, discussing his theory as to why Steiner did it, and the voice of Alain Cuny, the French actor who played the role of Steiner, and in the conversation with him that took place in a theater in Paris, explaining why he thinks Steiner did it, the role he played. And at the beginning of the broadcast, the voices of two people who saw the film in Chicago a couple of years ago, this conversation occurred. Nelson Algren, the writer, and Mario De Vecchi, who was an associate of Fellini in the making of the film. And so before we hear from excerpts from the early Chicago broadcast and those that follow, a word from our sponsors. Well, I must say, this question, the one question, there were many questions raised, of course, in the seeing of La Dolce Vita, even though it first played in Chicago a couple of years ago, even today is seen in outlying theaters. The question as to why this man, Steiner, friend of Marcello, the columnist, central figure, did what he did, the man who, as the phrase goes, had everything. And this is seemed to be more provoking than the mystery of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane and the mystery of the question of Rosebud. Who was Rosebud? In this case, why did Steiner do it? So let's begin with a conversation that took place a couple of years ago in the studio as we ask both Nelson Algren, the writer, and Mario De Vecchi, Fellini's associate, as to why they think he did it in their seeing of the film. Steiner, who this intellectual who has his weaknesses, very definite weaknesses, feels because he is a thing he does himself in. He kills himself.
He says himself,
yeah.
I'm no bigger than this.
Yes.
When you look at my true stature,
Yeah.
I'm no bigger than this. Yes, he says that.
Is the fact that he was detached. He used the word several times, didn't he, Steiner? I feel he's affluent, seems well, family seems fine, beautiful, friends seem interesting, yet he used the word, I am detached, doesn't he?
We must live, that is, we should live detached, meaning
Steiner.
that all these things that he feels should not be felt, perhaps.
Well, this is a disease.
It is a disease, no question about it. I mentioned also to Nelson another thing regarding Steiner in La Dolce Vita. I mentioned the fact that he, Steiner, is the only person, call him a person, a thing, whatever you may wish, is the only one who does not belong in this so-called sweet life. And therefore Fellini has to destroy him, just like he destroys the miracle tree.
Yeah.
He has to be destroyed. Badly, he perhaps belongs to the earth, but mentally, spiritually, the man is living in the future. He mentions that all the time. He is definitely living in the future, and therefore, being that everyone in La Dolce Vita belongs to the earth, and being that Steiner is here on earth, but not belonging to La Dolce Vita, the sweet life, he must be destroyed. And he destroys with him the children who seemingly are going to grow intellectual as the father is. Because
As detached too, perhaps.
As detached too. We see during the film, during that particular scene when the children appear, we already feel that these children are going to be raised according to the likeness of the father. Because he mentions that one child is very bright, his eyes are very bright because he recognizes beauty in a flower. And then he laughs because he knows that he has understood the beauty of the flower. And he also mentions about the little girl, the fact that she is very wonderful in sometimes inventing new phrases. And he mentions one particular phrase that he has noticed, who is the mother of the sun? And Steiner says, don't you think this is the phrase of a poet already?
Yeah.
So we can see that the children, are going to be raised into in that particular climate, atmosphere, call it whatever you may wish. But we know that eventually they are going to grow up to be intellectuals themselves. So Steiner feels compelled that with him they too have to be destroyed.
Well, this again comes back to Nelson's point, a cry for help. Here is Steiner, the detached intellectual, destroys that which he loves because he fears they will find their present as loathsome as he seems to find his present. See, I'm wondering, Nelson, when you say cry for help for what? To be what? To do what?
To feel. To feel.
Cry for help to feel. To feel is the way Nelson Algren interpreted the film itself. The conversation continued with De Vecchi and with Algren, discussing other aspects of the film, the dehumanization, the lack of standards, the nature of decadence itself. And there are some very whimsical comments made by Algren in which he was relating Roman decadence and Chicago decadence, and he said, they have us outstripped even when it comes to that. But the subject of Steiner was recurring throughout. There was a great deal of talk, of course, concerning the role Marcello played, why he seemed less than he might have been. But again, Steiner entered the conversation. Isn't this what threw Steiner too, Nelson? He spoke of the organized, safe world in which he lived.
Well, it seemed to me he was protesting the idea of total security, of total protection. I mean that there's a great risk to the human personality, that the human personality can't survive under total security. I think you mentioned that somebody mentioned it the other day. That the highest suicide rate in the Western world, at least, is in Sweden,
Yes.
where the problems of survival are at a minimum.
So a cradle to the grave, then, can bring a quick grave, quicker than expected, because, you mean, there's no challenge to the human being. Is this, you mean?
There is no value to life. Doesn't have the value. There's no struggle.
That was one man's view, perhaps the view of a great many men in looking at this particular role of Steiner. This is a conversation that occurred a couple of years ago in Chicago. Anyway, this was bothering me while I was in Rome, and eventually saw Fellini and Marcello Mastroianni, and in Paris saw Cuny. But in Rome, ran into Mastroianni, and this is an excerpt from the interview with him, the conversation with him. The full interview with Mastroianni will be heard on some later date at this hour. But who can portray Nowhere Man better than Marcello Mastroianni? And this was in between dubbings for this new film, Fellini 8½, in which he again plays the leading role, someone wholly different from Marcello. He talks animatedly of the other roles he's played and how they're all varied facets of a certain kind of 20th century man whose life is empty and wasted. We know him, too, as a very deft comedian, as he can be seen these days in Chicago in Divorce Italian style. He's a witty, vital artist, more than a handsome face here. But the question we asked him, surely he must know the answer to the question that gnaws. Why did Steiner, the man who had everything in La Dolce Vita, kill himself and his kids? And patiently, Mastroianni is lighting my crooked cigar, it's forever going out, as he tries to answer this question. Now here was Marcello's admiration for Steiner. His admiration for Steiner, yet his discovery that Steiner himself was empty. I liked his interpretation of this, perhaps. His
Dice che Terkel in Francia ha fatto un'intervista con Cuny, che ha fatto Steiner. E questa ammirazione di Steiner, di Marcello per Steiner, e la sua scoperta che in questo momento anche Steiner in fin dei conti è vuoto dentro. Vorrei sapere cosa sente, se lei sente in questo senso.
Ma forse, per me non è chiaro che lui scopra che Steiner è vuoto dentro. Mi pare che immediatamente lui ne sia affascinato da Steiner, perché Steiner per lui rappresenta tutto quello che lui non è riuscito mai ad essere.
Ma poi
Cioè,
a un certo momento c'è questo suicidio di Steiner.
ma sì, evidente, dopo c'è il crollo di tutto. Io credevo che nel corso della vicenda lui avesse già intuito il vuoto di Steiner.
no,
Dopo sì.
sì.
Ma si capisce perché lo scoprire il vuoto di Steiner significa aver... toglie a Marcello qualsiasi possibilità di speranza. In Steiner lui vedeva quello che avrebbe potuto essere, cioè un uomo leale, un uomo vero profondo, un uomo colto, un uomo con una famiglia meravigliosa, un uomo che raccoglie attorno a sé delle persone intelligenti, la serenità, e poi glielo dice anche. È chiaro che credendo ancora nell'esistenza di certi individui, per Marcello è già una speranza. Ma al momento in cui Steiner si suicida è il crollo di tutto, e difatti non si salva più. Ma questo senza dubbio, certo, è così.
Questo, oltre che come fatto cinematografico, è un fatto anche reale, insomma, nella vita vera. Of course, Marcello believes that feels that Steiner is everything he couldn't be. Steiner is successful, is intelligent, has a nice family, has a happy family, has around himself groups of intelligent people. He's everything that Marcello could not be. So he believes in the possibility of becoming somebody through Steiner. When Steiner kills himself, everything collapses around Marcello. Marcello has lost any hope that one could become somebody like that.
Well, perhaps I could
like
ask
Steiner.
Mr. Fellini. I don't want to take Mr. Mastroianni's time on this about his feelings. Why Steiner did what he did? Or does Marcello Mastroianni have an idea? Why do you feel Steiner, having all this seemingly, killed himself and his kids? Why did Steiner do this?
Vorrebbe sapere da lei perché pensa lei che Steiner si sia ucciso, avendo queste cose apparentemente, avendo il successo, l'intelligenza, la famiglia, eccetera, perché si è ucciso?
Perché era un uomo debole, incapace di sopravvivere a certi fatti drammatici o estremamente impegnativi che lui intravedeva in un futuro abbastanza vicino, e problemi dei quali lui si è reso conto di essere incapace a risolvere. Cioè un uomo troppo sensibile e allo stesso tempo estremamente debole, cioè non virile.
Because we come back to the same problem. He was weak. He was weak and too sensitive at the same time. Having felt that he was going to face very involving problems that he could not cope with, and being so sensitive as to feel this, he was, on the other hand, too weak to face them, to solve these problems. Therefore, he killed himself because he was weak. He was not virile enough.
Dico, la rivelazione di questa impossibilità a risolvere questi problemi futuri per un intellettuale sono stati poi il segno per Steiner stesso della sua debolezza e della sua mediocrità, perché il mondo sereno e meraviglioso nel quale Steiner viveva era tutto fittizio. Un uomo del nostro tempo non vive in questa specie di bolla di sapone al di fuori delle asperità e delle assurdità della vita di questi giorni. Non era un'isola impossibile a sopravvivere, quella di Steiner, non era vera. Era falso il mondo che Steiner si era creato, per me, poi può darsi che Fellini lo veda in tutt'altro modo.
Marcello Mastroianni's interpretation of Steiner's crisis is that he kills himself because he realizes that he's not living a real life. All this world, all this family, etc., it's all fictitious. It's not real, because a man nowadays lives in doubts, lives in taken by all this anguish, these anxieties. So Steiner at a certain moment realizes that his life is up to that date. The environment he lives in, etc., are all constructed, are all fictitious.
Even his plans are all fictitious, he said. And this is Marcello Mastroianni's interpretation of Steiner's suicide. By the way, the voice of the translator is that of Carlo Baldi, whom you will hear later on too in the conversation with Fellini. And if you heard vaguely in the background a woman screaming, there was nothing to worry about. There was a dubbing of the film, Fellini 8½, and there was the voices being dubbed in various languages. And that was an actress trying the same speech again and again and again and missing it, because Fellini, though patient, was persistent and is a perfectionist. And so we go to Paris. And there, in Alain Cooney's dressing room on the wall, is a picture of Sonny Liston. the heavyweight champion. This is a small theater in which a Pirandello play is on the boards, and it's after a matinee on Saturday. Cuny, the French actor, played the role of Steiner in La Dolce Vita. And so we ask him, why did Steiner do it? Why did he commit suicide? And Cuny, you may recall his face, sort of a granite furrowed face, and his brow equally furrowed, thoughtfully blows smoke rings, and you watch the rings melt in the air, and you're reminded of the old Chesterfield ad. And then he offers an explanation that appears to me at the moment a bit more complex than even Mastroianni's.
Les signes extérieurs d'une vie équilibrée sont très souvent et affreusement trompeurs. On sait très bien derrière quelle façade vivent les gens prétendument heureux. Et il y a un humoriste français qui a eu cette parole. Ce qu'il y a d'admirable dans le bonheur des autres, c'est qu'on y croit. Or, ce bonheur, je n'y crois pas. Je crois qu'il est très difficile de parvenir à quelques secondes de joie personnelle, de joie partagée, et que, par exemple, pour aimer, il faut peut-être une vie entière pour entrevoir ce que peut-être...
You ask him why Steiner, so rich and cultivated and seemingly happy, did what he did at the end of his character. And Alain Cuny says that the external signs of the richness and culture are generally false. And we all know what hides behind such a show of richness and happiness. And a French humorist said once that what is admirable, what is wonderful in the happiness of others is that they make us believe it. But Mr. Cuny, he doesn't believe in it, doesn't believe really. And he believes that for loving, for instance, it needs a whole life to have sometimes little lights of happiness.
Why did Steiner, I remember he would play a little of Bach. Was he sort of a dilettante? Is that it? He would play Bach, or he taught. Why did he say, I feel this small? Sometimes I feel this small.
Pourquoi Steiner, à un moment, dit « Parfois, je me sens petit comme ça ».
Oui, parce que son amie, qui est, je crois, une Suédoise, lui dit « Vous nous apparaissez sous les dimensions d'une cathédrale ». Et il rit, ou plutôt il ricane même, en disant « Si vous pouviez me voir selon ma vraie taille, vous sauriez que je suis tout petit au contraire. »
Yes, Steiner has a friend, a Swedish friend, and she tells him, you appear to us as high as a cathedral. And he says, he sneers, he laughs, and says that if you could see me as I am really, as I feel really, you would see me that small. That's the sentence.
So he really had contempt for himself and knew all this.
Alors il se méprisait lui-même.
Non. Il ne se méprisait pas, mais il savait que sa vie, aussi bien professionnelle que conjugale que sociale, était un simulacre.
No, he didn't despise himself, but he knew that his life socially, with his work and his wife and his friend, was a fake, a total fake.
That then is Alain Cuny's interpretation. The translator in this instance was Michel Vian, who is Jean-Paul Sartre's secretary. And later on some forthcoming broadcast, the conversation in full with Alain Cuny, not only his tackling the role of Steiner, but his life as an actor and what he thinks of being an actor. So anyway, here are thus far four different interpretations of why Steiner did it. That of Nelson Algren, Chicago writer, Mario De Vecchi, an associate of Fellini, Marcello Mastroianni, the principal actor in the film, played the role of Marcello the columnist, and Alain Cuny, who played the role of Steiner. Well, finally, I'm about to catch the night plane out of Rome. This is the last day there. This is on a return. And there's a very weary Federico Fellini. I've just been watching the dubbing of his new film, Fellini 8½, which he will discuss in a moment, too. I'm impressed with the easy manner of his work. He talks of his faith in man and how in this film, this man will recognize himself, and herein lies the hope, whatever hope there is, recognition. But then I ask that last question. Fellini, after all, created the role of Steiner. Why did he do it? And he will explain why, and as he did, as this very gentle bear of a director talks, I thought of Steiner and Edward Arlington Robinson's Richard Cory, who was so admirable. You remember the lines, "So on we worked and waited for the light and went without meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head." In a moment, we'll hear the whole conversation with Fellini, which not only answers this question, but speaks of all his work and his credo as well. I've just had the privilege of watching, even we're on right now, the voice in the background is that of perhaps certainly one of the great film directors in the world today, Federico Fellini. And I had the privilege of watching some of the editing of the film, and I noticed the perfectionism of the man himself, and yet there was an ease too. There was a confidence in his work, the way he was handling the various little frames, the shots, the sound, and the actors themselves felt it too. Mr. Fellini, first of all, I'm very grateful for the privilege of watching some of the editing of this new work of yours, Fellini 8½, and I want to thank you for that very much.
Sì, quel doppiaggio è un lavoro un pochino noioso, francamente. Non è che io mi diverto.
Mr. Fellini says that dubbing is the most boring part of his work. It doesn't have the atmosphere, the gay atmosphere that you have when you shoot a film. That is the atmosphere that makes him like his work. As a matter of fact, he's surprised that you find this atmosphere, that he instead thinks is a little tense, because it's very boring and very technical, you see.
Of course.
Fastidita.
But I sense, even within this particular laborious, boring work, this particular air is there. Before we talk about up to now is his magnum opus, La Dolce Vita, perhaps the films that came to Chicago first, when we sensed a new film poet at work with La Strada, for example. In La Strada, the man's humanity came through. I'm thinking, for example, of the strong man, the part played by Quinn. At the very end of the film, even the brute is a human being, we sense, as he cries upon the sand alone.
E che cosa devo dire io a questo proposito?
What do you want to know about this?
Now, I know it seems to be the recurring theme of all his films, the indomitability, in a sense, of the human spirit. You have the little prostitute in Cabiria.
Il motivo ricorrente sia questa indomitabilità dell'essere umano, insomma.
Sì, insomma, ho fiducia negli uomini, perché
Mr. Fellini says that he believes in human beings, and he doesn't think that one could make a film in which there isn't this belief, this trust, this belief in human beings. He says maybe a man from Mars could do it, but since I am a man and I work with men, I live with men, it's obvious that I believe in men.
Of course, I raised the point about these two films prior to La Dolce Vita for a certain reason, do you see? Here was the little prostitute. In the very beginning, he works directly. A man pushes her into the lake, tries to kill her, in a sense, steal her money. At the very end, she's betrayed again, and yet there she marches, still alive. I'm raising this point as a lead-in to another approach to the theme of La Dolce Vita. And now we come to the element of dehumanization in our day. Would he say, if we were to choose one word, one theme that is the theme of the tapestry La Dolce Vita, I suppose it would be the dehumanization of man.
Non mi sembra comunque che il protagonista della Dolce Vita sia da considerarsi.
He doesn't feel that Marcello in La Dolce Vita is dehumanized. Even he's always on the verge of disintegration. Because he disperses. He's in a dispersion. He's always disponible. His disponibility, his open disponibility, puts him always on the verge of being disintegrated. But even in the last look in his eyes, full of nostalgia for something that he's losing, that he has lost, that he doesn't know what it is, he feels that there is a charge of humanity. humanity that is such also because it is always in the risk of being lost, of being dehumanized.
Qualcosa di incomprensibile, che sta diventando qualcosa che non si riesce nemmeno più a decifrare. Mi sembra che anche in quel punto lì Marcello sia carico di umanità, insomma, di umanità dolorosa, di un'umanità che rischia appunto di disumanizzarsi, ma che proprio in quell'attimo dove affiora una nostalgia così profonda e così accorante si dichiara di nuovo in tutta la sua forza.
There is this charge of humanity in the last scene, let us say, as the little Umbrian angel, the little girl, waves at him. But does he, you see, this is the question, does he feel that Marcello himself can be saved? See, we think of Marcello at the very end.
But, secondo me il fatto che il personaggio si salvi o non si salvi non è importante. È importante che lo spettatore raggiunga una tensione, cioè sia stimolato lui a pensare.
It's not important that the personage of the film is saved or not. What is important is to stimulate the public, to stimulate the public and bring it to a certain point of discussion. If one has, Mr. Fellini says, is not his point to make it a moral point. He works by instinct. He gets to this conclusion by instinct. But if one wants to make a moral point, in effect, as a matter of fact, he thinks it is more moral not to end the film with a positive ending. That is in a way an evasion for the public. It says, well, if it's finished well, the thing is solved, the problem is solved, and that's it. If you just get to the point where we don't know if it is saved or not, but it remains in the public, remains this stimulation.
Una tensione, cioè la possibilità di una riflessione.
And thus he wants the audience to react, to leave the theatre saying, well, perhaps something must or should be done, or the audience, it's when the audience cried, basta, basta, enough, enough. He was happy to hear this, I assume, then, because he irked them or he stimulated them.
Era la stessa cosa anche negli altri film, anche il fatto che Cabiria alla fine sorridesse riconfortata così per un atto.
It's the same with Cabiria. The film ends with the smile of Cabiria, moved by the homage of the human message from these little kids, little boys, yes. But what is going to do with Cabiria tomorrow? We don't know. It's the same with Zampano on the beach. It's what they do tomorrow. It's a problem that concerns them. That do not concern us. They don't belong to this reality. They are artistic inventions. What is important is that the public is faced with the problem.
Che il pubblico senta che è lui che deve fare qualche cosa per Cabiria, no? È importante che il pubblico a quel punto
he has to feel that the public has to do something for Cabiria. He's facing a problem with his general. Cabiria is only a mean. He's only an instrument.
This may sound strange to say, but Federico Fellini, in this sense, is not too far removed from Bertolt Brecht, in a strange sort of way, in that he too says to the audience, you think about this and perhaps do something about it. Is this too far? Ask him if this is too inapropos.
Gli ha fatto pensare questo che lei diceva a Bertolt
Totally
Brecht.
different, you understand.
Non da un punto di vista tecnico, ma come impostazione, diciamo, etica di un dialogo col pubblico.
Ma io insomma credo che ogni artista sincero trovi la sua moralità in questa forma di messaggio, cioè in questo tendere fino allo spasimo una partecipazione dello spettatore a cui si rivolge, o del lettore, o di chi guarda un quadro, o di chi sente un concerto.
He feels that any honest artist feels the need to stimulate this participation of the public towards certain problems. And may I add, as a man who has seen La Dolce Vita quite a few times and has participated in many panel discussions, La Dolce Vita created in Italy and I believe in many other parts of the world a serial of discussions, of meetings, and we were all stimulated in discussing certain problems that were very important for us.
Indeed, this huge tapestry that is La Dolce Vita, a tapestry or a mural, La Dolce Vita. You chose Rome. Of course, Rome is your city, but Rome seems so interesting too. The new and the old of Rome, the new constructions going up as against an eternal aspect of... Do you have something specific in mind in choosing Rome?
Perché ho scelto Roma? Un pochino difficile sempre tentare di identificare quali sono state le ragioni.
He says that it is difficult to analyze the reasons why he has chosen Rome instead of another city. Maybe it's very probable that he has chosen Rome because it's the place where he works, the place that he knows best. Because actually, as far as Dolce Vita is concerned, the paysage, the physical environment is not essential. He has reinvented all this Rome. As a matter of fact, he doesn't know. He doesn't go to the Veneto. He has never participated in an orgy or has never been around the prince's home. And yet he has invented it, and just because it is invented, probably it's more poignant.
Quindi è tutta una Roma di fantasia, che forse proprio perché di fantasia è molto più vera di quella reale.
Well, the fact, too, that probably is a Via Veneto society in every industrial city of the world. It is not Rome alone, because obviously it's the universal quality of it. We see this. I'm curious about several things. He chose as the protagonist, or the anti-hero, a newspaper columnist. This is rather interesting. Mi ask me why he chose a columnist.
Ho trovato praticamente interessante il fatto che lei abbia scelto come protagonista un giornalista di tipo particolare, quello che loro in America chiamano il columnist, cioè un reporter d'attualità, un redattore d'attualità.
Sì, perché mi sembra che i drammi che si raccontano nella Dolce Vita, il tipo di persone, i personaggi che si incontrano e le loro storie non sono degni di uno storico, come poteva essere Svetonio o Tacito, insomma, ognuno di noi ha gli storici che si merita, quindi mi pareva giusto raccontare quelle avventure lì attraverso l'occhio di un giornalista abbastanza squallido, insomma, abbastanza miserabile.
He found that each time has the stories that it deserves. And of course, he could have to tell the stories that the Dolce Vita, a squalid society as that Dolce Vita, found its right historian, not in an important involved one like Svetonio or Tacitus, but in a columnist.
Strangely enough, that this columnist, in a very small way, is a Tacitus of his time. Yes. I mean, this is ironic, obviously, yes, because this concerns itself with the next question I'm about to ask Mr. Fellini, the lack of values of quality. I'm asking Mastroianni earlier about the role. In the very first scene, there is a Christ on the helicopter blessing the city, and this is as important or as of little importance to the columnist as the next scene, in which he's seeing who is sitting with whom in a nightclub. The lack of difference between standards
of values.
Sì, questo tipo di sguardo impietoso e anche senza possibilità senza scale di valori, insomma, dove tutto quanto è guardato con lo stesso occhio di pura curiosità,
The lack of unmerciful look at things. Everything is seen with the same eye, with the same curious eye. Curious in a negative sense, though, that it is typical of our time, where a big tragedy, a great event, or the election of a miss, they're all the same value.
Yes, and thus it is with a columnist. This is a rather interesting approach, this Tacitus, small-time Tacitus of our time. Yet a question always comes up. The man he admired, Marcello Steiner. I interviewed Alain Cuny in Paris, and he gave a rather roundabout interpretation of Steiner's decision. Here is a man who seems to have everything, Steiner, as in a poem by Edward Arlington Robinson, America, and one day went home, put a bullet in his head. Why, I'd like to ask Mr. Fellini, who created this, why Steiner, seemingly happy, did what he did to himself and to his kids. It's a question often asked, I know.
Una domanda che mi avrà fatto 10 milioni di volte.
This is the cliché question.
Sì. Ma io a questa domanda non ho mai saputo rispondere.
It is a question that very often was asked Mr. Fellini. And he says he's afraid he cannot give an answer as precise as the question itself. As a matter of fact, he doesn't know very precisely why Steiner killed himself. Perhaps because he had an intuition, because he had an intuition of being, he could have been able to do something that he couldn't do, like an angel living. All of a sudden realized that he lived up to that time like an angel amongst monkeys. But anyway, what was important for Mr. Fellini as a narrator, as an inventor of a story, was to have an episode that could be a shock for Marcello and make him realize that his life was not a life but a way of living, and that he identified a way of living with life. And in this case, when this happens, it is real hell, it is desperation, it is madness.
Così come inventore di storia, era di dare a Marcello, il protagonista, lo shock di un episodio che riassumesse tutta l'assurda irrazionalità, il caos così magmatico del suo modo di vivere, insomma, che non è la vita, ma è solamente un modo di vivere, e che diventa allucinante perché un modo di vivere, quando viene identificato come vita, è spaventoso, insomma, è proprio veramente l'inferno, insomma, il vuoto, ecco, l'inferno come vuoto, come assenza di un principio, di uno sviluppo, di una fine.
There was a line that Steiner used. I was curious about it when he speaks to Marcello out on the patio. He says, I feel so safe. You know, we think so much of security ourselves, certain kind of material security. I wonder if that wasn't a key there to us.
Certo, sì, questo senso di insicurezza che proviamo tutti quanti, insomma, questo senso di provvisorietà, sì.
The intuition of a sudden intuition of the illusion of this sense of safety. The problem we all feel this sense of insecurity of not being safe. Therefore, Steiner might have had the intuition that his safety, his sense of security was.
I suppose a sort of spiritual emptiness in the midst of a material wealth. That is, he was surrounded by things, but the man himself seemed, even Steiner, a little hollow. Waste seems to be on the mind of Mr. Fellini. The tragedy of waste. This is in La Strada, the waste of human beings, and here again the waste in a larger sense.
Disponibilità dissanguante, insomma, in questo senso qui, no? Sì. Intende Ma è una domanda?
Sì, è un'osservazione giusta la sua, è una cosa che ha sentito giustamente, c'è effettivamente questo senso.
It's a recurring theme.
Sì, ma però non mi sembra che il mio sguardo così di cantastorie sia, quando racconto una vita così disordinata, sgangherata, fatta di sentieri invece che di strade maestre, di scorciatoie che invece allungano la strada. Mi sembra che ci sia sempre, però.
It's a long talk. It's not confused.
No, it's on the contrary. Take your time.
Anyway,
there's a credo involved.
He's very optimistic about us, about human beings. He doesn't feel that he has taken a negative attitude or a judging attitude towards this waste and so forth. Of course, if one is, he says this waste, this going around, this wandering around, looking for a truth that we have, has a certain value, and he sees it with a sympathizing eye. He feels that he thinks he was able to express this sympathy, this solidarity, this participation in everything these personages do and so forth. Even in the paysage, in the things they wear, he tried to express it also formally.
Ma anche questo zittagare può essere pieno di poesia, però.
Appunto dico, ma anche quel zittagare lì ha un senso, anche quella è una crescita, non credo.
And to come to his last film, he says, the last film is a funeral in a way. But is not macabre. Is not. I would say I'm using a figurative language in this case, in trying to translate. It has a message of hope in a way. We see it. He says, I see it, and I have this feeling that of expectancy for something to come, for a big carnival. And I think, I hope also the public will feel this.
I'm delighted.
So it is a funeral. It is a funeral on ruins, but it leaves you.
Not the end. It is just the beginning.
Of course.
It is a beginning.
Well, this is, I must say this, Mr. Fellini, I am delighted to hear you say this, because this is what personally, as one viewer, have felt in every one of your films. I use this phrase again, the indomitableness of the human spirit. And you say there is no ending. You were speaking of a decay, a decaying kind of society.
Sì, a decay is a certain kind of liberation. It
With
is
a
a way
regrowth.
to become free. In questo film qui, proprio alla fine, Marcello dice una lunga battuta che è un pochino riassuntiva di tutto il film. Lui dice che non ha conclusioni da dire, che non sa dire niente, parla con la moglie naturalmente, che non sa dire niente di più alla moglie, né alla moglie né agli altri, e che al di fuori di questa confusione, che questa confusione però non lo spaventa più, perché questa confusione è proprio lui, è proprio
Marcello in
se
his
stesso.
last
Lui non ha
film
più bisogno di nascondere,
has a few
mascherare.
lines in the end where he admits, he recognizes the fact that he actually is his doubts, he is his confusion. He recognizes himself in this confusion, these doubts, and only by admitting this he can start again with free of complexes given him by a wrong education, free of the way of life that was imposed upon him by environment, free by the conditioning elements in which he up to them lived. Only by admitting this he is free and he is real, and he can start again in a new. He finds a new humanity by admitting that his confusion, his doubts is the essence of himself. He is these elements.
Senza più cupe malinconie, o senza più rimorsi così negativi che non portano a niente. No? Il film è un po' una specie di così clamoroso esame di coscienza, molto sgangherato, comico, perché è un film comico, non pensoso nel senso così che si dà di solito a questa parola, insomma.
Discovering false values, or the falsity of values, man is able to throw off the burden of these false values. And thus
Dice anche io mi rifiuto di capire da adesso in poi, non voglio più capire niente, voglio soltanto credere a tutto quanto.
At the end he says, I refuse to try to understand. I cannot understand. I refuse to try to understand. I give up trying to understand. I only want to believe.
this is where, now this is at the
end, Marcello, this last film.
You're talking about Fellini 8.5 now.
Yes,
You're talking about
yes.
Fellini 8.5.
Yes,
I was
yes.
about to ask you about Fellini 8.5,
Yes.
which is probably is a step beyond
Yes,
now. You
yes.
see, you don't mind if I ask you this question? Fellini 8.5 would this be? It's a question often asked naturally. Is it autobiographical? It's a silly question, perhaps. Is it autobiographical in nature, part of your own? Since La Dolce Vita is part of your thoughts and imagination, is this part of a life of yours, in a sense of reflection?
Dice se ci sono degli elementi, dice ponendo la Dolce Vita come un film del suo pensiero, questo si può dire film in un certo senso della sua vita, ci sono degli elementi autobiografici, ci sono sempre.
Io sarei autobiografico anche se raccontassi la vita di un merluzzo, quindi si figuri un po' in questo film qui dove parlo di un regista, quindi. Ma però non è un'identificazione così in superficie, perché anzi il pericolo di questo film, almeno per un certo pubblico ristretto, è il fatto di una identificazione di pettegolezzo, insomma, che mi darebbe un po' fastidio, quella non c'è proprio. Certo in profondità, come si fa a non essere autobiografici, insomma?
An artist is always autobiographic. He says, of course, this is a film about the director. I would be autobiographical if I wrote a film about a fish. I wrote a film about a director. There are autobiographical elements, but there is no identification in this.
The very nature of his personal life and observations of necessity in every work he does. This has to be.
I would like to point out to Mr. Fellini that your point about the indubitability of the human spirit. Ancora una volta desideravo di precisare che lui sente proprio in tutti i suoi film questo tema suo ricorrente della indomitabilità dello spirito umano, dello spirito umano, di invincibilità dello spirito umano, che non si arrende totalmente, ha sempre una possibilità di riscatto, insomma.
Infatti questa qui tutto sommato è la cosa che mi commuove di più, cioè il complimento. Il suo complimento è una definizione un po' volgare, voglio dire, è la frase più toccante che mi poteva
He's very happy what you said about the indomitability of the human spirit, because he really he wants this, he likes this. He would like to be able to give the public a certain element that is hidden in us, he said to vibrate a certain chord that develops certain echoes in the spirit of
il sacrosanto, quello che dice lei, dovrebbero camminare insieme. Non credo a una soluzione che preveda soltanto così proprio il riscatto dalla dignità dell'essere uomo, così sul piano proprio sociale soltanto, ecco. Penso che quella lì certamente, ma l'altra insieme. No, quello che si faccia una società di automi un'altra volta.
Sì, questo è. I made the remark, and Mr. Fellini has precise the point that this echo, this element in that he wants to bring out in the public helps. I said it's also an element which helps to fight our fighting to reacquire our human dignity. He says yes, that's all right, but not only that, also the other, also. Not only something that has a social implication, social impact, also a poetical.
I was about to come to the poetry, and there is then the very nature of Mr. Fellini's films involve a poetry. The fact is, it was not the Rome that he personally knows, but the Rome of his imagination. He sees the implications of it, and thus it is with Cabiria. It's not a certain particular prostitute he knew, but a certain human condition. And thus it is with the poet, clown, and the strong man in Strada. So the poetry of your films, perhaps this is a key thing in your thoughts and mind, is it not, Mr. Fellini? The poetry.
Sì, certo.
Mr. Fellini, this question I'm about to ask, every film you've had seems to indicate a growth. Well, every artist grows. But now we come to since you're convinced, you're affirmative, you feel affirmative about the human race. This figure, the hero of your latest film, the one of which I just saw the dubbing, now recognizes
himself.
He recognizes himself, his weaknesses, and from this recognition then can come the light.
Yes, that's perfectly right. He recognizes and he accepts himself. I can explain a language that I don't know.
Why don't you go ahead and say it?
Italian?
Yeah, say it in Italian.
Sì, la conquista che questo personaggio, che in fondo è sempre lo stesso, perché io credo
It's the recognition of his limits. Guido, the personage of Mr. Fellini's last film, at the end becomes aware of his limits, recognizes his limits, and he accepts himself as he is. But he is not a passive acceptance. It's a religious acceptance of himself. Immediately he becomes aware of the value of man as he is, and therefore gives up his struggle to try to understand, to try to find a certain truth. He gives up his conflict, he overcomes his conflict with life and the world. Mr. Fellini said that the last line he says are, I do not want to try to understand anymore, I want to believe. And this, I think, my own judgment, is very much in the line of the modern philosophy. Albert Camus and Sartre have, in different ways, said the same thing. I mean, a man's recognition of his own limits gives, and the awareness of its own, of the limits inherent of the human position, are a way to freedom. Only if a man understands this, he is free. He knows where he stands and is free to make a choice. And there only he can jump into faith. That can be religious faith, political faith, but is a choice in a faith.
Basically, then, what Federico Fellini was saying as we end our interview right now, before we bid each other farewell, at least for now, is that
man, he still believes very much in man. Earlier we spoke of the indomitability of the human spirit. This basically is his belief.
Yeah.
And in the recognition, in Guido's recognition, the part that Mastroianni plays in Fellini 8½, the recognition of his own frailties and flaws, the open
And yet
avenue
his
to
acceptance
new-
of this,
yes, and his
of
acceptance
this element,
as
not
human being.
passively.
You must go and I must go. And again, thank you very much,
Sorry to
Federico.
give you so little time, but
We will do it again some other time. Good luck on the
Noi
film.
di
Dopo
averlo
le
fatto via del
torna di là.
tempo, sì. Grazie infinite, grazie.
And thus the conversation ended. Fellini went back into the studio. There were about, I must say, there were about 30 actors waiting impatiently to keep on, to continue dubbing scenes in the film you will be seeing one day soon, Fellini 8½. Perhaps a postscript is in order now. The last question, the last comment of Carlo Baldi in reference to Fellini's comments calls for, obviously, another conversation we hope someday soon about man not seeking to understand but to believe. I think this will call for further conversation, I hope. A word should be said about Carlo Baldi, the interpreter, who is quite a figure himself. He was my constant companion in Rome. He is a producer for RAI, Radio Televisione Italiana, and a highly creative figure himself. There'll be an interview with him, his own story, which is a very colorful one and dramatic one, soon on the series, too. And a postscript to the postscript on the subject of Steiner. That was one of the segments of the conversation with Fellini, and that was discussed earlier in the program by Mastroianni, by Nelson Algren, and by Alain Cuny. It's interesting that each one who sees the film or partakes has his own view of why a man does something, and then you ask the man who created the figure, and he says, I don't know for sure. And yet we know this is a case of the artist's subconscious at work. Sometimes intuition is involved, and if he's creative enough intuitively, he is right, as certainly Fellini was, for everything that Steiner did seemed natural, and perhaps, not perhaps, certainly each one who viewed it, those you heard, was right in his own way, too. An artist at work, Federico Fellini.